Good morning. Welcome to Global Beat Radio. I'm Layla Mashkour from the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition, and I'd like to welcome you to our show on Wednesday, May 22nd, 2012. Today marks the 100th day of protesting in Montreal. Students have been organizing using interesting methods to protest the Quebec government's attempts to raise tuition fees by 75% over 7 years. That's an increase of roughly $1,700 per student. Last week, the government put an offer on the table to essentially freeze current tuition fees. Today we will be discussing that offer and more with our Montreal correspondent Rebecca Acheson. Then we will be featuring a panel discussion with Institute members Adnan Raja, Gent Llukaj, Khaoula Bengezi, and Pittman. Since our recording, student groups have rejected the offer, and on May 18th, the Quebec government passed an emergency law entitled An Act to Enable Students to Receive Instruction from the Post-Secondary Institutions They Attend, or Bill 78. This bill is unprecedented and possibly unconstitutional, as it works to deny Canadians the freedom of assembly and tries to remove and silence voices of dissent. This bill essentially says groups of 50 people who are demonstrating, with no actual definition of what constitutes demonstrating, would have to give police written warning of their whereabouts, numbers, time of, and duration of any demonstration at least 8 hours in advance, or it is automatically illegal. Of particular interest is Article 29, which reads, anyone who, by an act or omission, helps, or by encouragement, advice, consent, authorization, or command, induces a person to commit an offense under this act, is guilty of the same offense, and can be fined accordingly. Fines range from $1,000 to $125,000 for the first violation, doubling for each one after that. Wearing a red felt square pinned on oneself has become an international symbol of solidarity with the protesters, and Grammy Award-winning band The Arcade Fire were even seen wearing these squares on their recent SNL performance. Now some are speculating whether wearing this red felt pin or even sending a tweet could be considered encouragement and thus deemed illegal. This raises important questions surrounding agency, democracy, and the creeping authoritarianism in Western society.
National Briefing.
Now we have Rebecca Acheson, our special correspondent reporting from Montreal. Rebecca is a McGill student, double majoring in psychology and philosophy. She joins us today from Montreal. Good morning, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about the current deal that is on the table in this Montreal protest, and it's attempting to end the 13-week class boycott and the student protests that have been ongoing?
Yeah, definitely. Right now, so the original proposal by the government was to increase tuition over 5 years. They've extended that to over 7 years, but from what I understand, the initial increase would have been 75%, and over 7 years, when it's adjusted for inflation, it will end up being an 82% increase. As well as with this deal, there would be a separate commission to oversee university spending. And so the deal that was struck was that the tuition hike would stay, but the commission would be mandated to cut costs from ancillary fees that students pay at the same rate as the tuition increase.
So student groups are currently voting on this deal, but on Sunday night there was a march of about 2,000 students protesting this latest offer, and many of the recent reports that are coming out from Montreal say there is a high possibility that the current offer will be rejected. Can you speak a little bit about what the reaction has been on the ground to this latest offer?
It sounds like the deal has been rejected by most, if not all, student groups. What happened was that the kind of big student federations, if you can call them that, signed to deal saying that it would then be left up to the different departments to vote on their own, and that they couldn't actually say whether or not the strike was over. There was a lot of discontent after the deal came out, with the student federations themselves saying that what was signed and what was published was not what they had originally agreed to, that there was some manipulation inside the room to kind of fatigue the representatives into signing the deal, and that what was said publicly outside of the room than what was said publicly, or what was said privately, rather, inside the negotiation table. And up to students to vote, and as far as I know, I think every student group that's on it so far has rejected the offer.
And do you think that these student groups and the protesters can maintain momentum as the protest keeps going and as they most likely reject this offer?
Well, we'll have to see what happens, because at this point, they may end up losing their semester. And most students are out of school now, as it is. So I believe that the thing was that if they accepted the offer, that they could retrieve their semester and they would finish classes around the middle or end of June. I'm not sure what's going to happen now that they've rejected the offer once again.
There are a lot of groups getting involved with these protests, from Amnesty International criticizing the use of force by police to Montreal high school students boycotting their own classes. So would you say the reaction towards the protesters from the general Montreal public, has it been primarily positive or negative?
It's really hard to answer that question, because there's been no one linear point of view. It's very, very different all across the board, even in terms of people who, don't support the strike, but they also don't support some of the actions by the police, or people who support the strike but don't support the actions by the students. And there's really no one or even two or three positions that you can kind of call out. There's just so many different points of view that you hear all the time.
Can you speak to some of the criticisms that are being voiced regarding the protest or the protesters?
Yes. This is quite an involved answer. I have to say that I don't actually agree with the strike. I'm much more sympathetic to their cause than I was when it all started. And regardless of my personal views, from what I can tell, people outside of Quebec are in favor of the hike and opposed to the strike. So I might play a little bit of devil's advocate here. I'll go through some of their criticisms and then I guess the response that the students have as well. I think there are about 4 or 5 main criticisms. One of the big ones being an increase of less than $2,000, which would give them a grand total of still less than $4,000, which is easily made in a summer job. Still one of the lowest tuitions in Canada. What they say to that is that one of the points being that tuition is only some of the cost of going to school. There are still books and rent and utilities, and that whether or not the amount of money you have shouldn't prevent you from doing something like taking an unpaid summer internship, which it very well can if you have to take a summer job, which I realize to the rest of Canada is not really even something we'd consider. This amount of money seems pretty marginal, which brings me to the next one, being that Quebec students need to stop whining. They have the lowest tuition in Canada, and even with the increase, it's not going to be much more. I held on to this point of view and this criticism for a long time, and it took a couple weeks of hearing the response for me to kind of change my mind a bit. So the response to that would be the question shouldn't be why Quebec is paying so little, it should be why the rest of Canada is paying so much. I'm not saying they're right in this particular fight, but the argument that they are paying less than the rest of us and should just kind of suck it up is similar to having, 2 siblings around the same age, 2 young siblings, and you say to one, either you and your sister can each have 2 pieces of candy, or you can have 3, but then she's going to have 4. Most often the siblings are going to want what's equal. And I think in this case, that kind of thinking is a roadblock, and it stops people from looking into maybe more important arguments and bigger arguments in this whole situation. Another one being that the rest of Canada is kind of paying a lot of Quebecois tuition, and that the money from federal taxes is going towards this, and that Quebec needs to kind of just accept what the government's telling them. And the thing here is that the students are basically asking the government to reassess its priorities as they're, as a people asking something of the government, that they're asking their government not, spend more money that they're getting from the federal government necessarily, but that they reallocate the resources they do have and make tuition a priority. In Montreal itself, one of the huge problems is, these students need to stop blocking traffic and disrupting the lives of working class people who are just trying to make ends meet. And this one is pretty, hard to, there's no real argument against it, other than to say that to have your voice heard, protesters have to do something, right? Every demonstration needs to have something, and that's basically how they're choosing to go about it. Last week they did a barely dressed protest, and that seemed to get some attention as well. lastly, I was talking to a shop owner last week, and one of the criticisms he made is one that you hear kind of frequently, which is that the city is spending so much money on overtime for police. You know, like how much money have they spent already in damages from when the protests get a little radical, and no one really knows. And normally that's an amount of money that gets kind of blamed on students. You know, the students are complaining that the government is wasting all this money that they should be spending on education, and yet the students themselves are willing to waste government money on police overtime. But there's also the argument that why is the government watching their young people out in the streets without, some would say, trying to actually come to an agreement that they can really stand by, that the students will actually support. And so I think that that's one that's kind of on both shoulders as well.
Mm-hmm. And so there have been a lot of reports, speaking of police, about their use of excessive force against the protesters and the students. What has been your personal experience with the police during these protests?
Myself personally, the only personal experience that I've had, a friend of mine got stuck in a demonstration and just kind of the police pointed her to the safest route home. I know there have been some very serious injuries in protester-police clashes, including a student at McGill who had to get surgery after one of these clashes about 8 weeks ago, and then I think around March a student ended up actually losing his eye after a clash with police. But I mean, I've also seen, you know, protesters thank the police and watch them wave goodbye to each other and give each other peace signs, so it's just not a simple issue.
Mm-hmm. French culture has this sort of long history of successful student protesting, and as tuition fees are increasing all across Canada, it seems we're only seeing this active sort of speaking out against the increases from Quebec students. So I'm wondering, what do you think it is that makes Quebec so unique?
Well, I think that it's just that. I think that it's the history behind it. The Quebec student movement is one that goes back to the 60s, and this is one of the reasons that their tuition has stayed so low. The success of these past protests is also one of the reasons that's cited for why there's such a massive increase, why there's a 75% increase now, which is that they've been so successful in the past that now this massive hike has to happen. Reports say that after this increased tuition will be at the same level as 1968 if you take inflation into account. And as far as the rest of Canada, I don't know what it is about Quebec other than this very successful history, although I did see that there was a group who I don't want to name because I'm not sure I have it right, that was actually calling for student protests in Ontario in the fall. So I'm not sure how that's going to pan out.
And just any final sort of predictions or sort of your best guess at how you see things proceeding from here?
I think it's going to be a very interesting summer in Montreal and in Quebec in general. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. And I guess we'll see. The next academic year could be a very interesting one.
Great. And is there anything else you'd like to add to our discussion today?
I guess I would just ask that people kind of give every side of the argument a few minutes of their time.
Fantastic. It was a pleasure having you on our show today.
Thanks. It was great to talk to you.
Looking local.
Hello, my name is Sean Pittman, and I'm a student at the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Khaoula Bengezi, Adnan Raja, and Gent Llukaj. We will be having a panel discussion on the Montreal protests regarding a proposed tuition hike of $1,625 per student over 7 years. So let's begin with Khaoula. Can you discuss some of the tactics used by the police and protesters?
Well, I found the tactics conducted by the students to be more effective than the police. So, for instance, they used a lot of nonviolent tactics such as sit-ins. They boycotted going to university. They also had themes, so they'd wear little clothing some days, and they also had a flag, this red flag that represented their movement, whereas the police kind of came at them more violently. For the main part, the protests were largely conducted with no violence, but recently there was a violent protest where a protester lost an eye, 9 people were sent to the hospital, and the students also retaliated against the police, which resulted in some police officers going to the hospital as well. But overall, yeah, the protests have been conducted peacefully.
Yeah, so the students have been mostly nonviolent, but do you think the same can be said for the police? It seems that there's almost a creeping authoritarianism and more of a police state sort of response to these nonviolent tactics.
Yeah, for sure, and you can see that being picked up even by the media, surprisingly. So I've read numerous articles that have stated that the police has used violent tactics, and how the premier government in Quebec has kind of allowed for that to happen. And overall, I think that the nonviolent tactics by the students has garnered them a lot of support from the media and from the public. So for instance, the Globe and Mail recently had an opinion poll which stated that like 89.6% of those who respondents stated that they were in support of the tuition decrease and in support of the student movement, and then only approximately 10% were saying that they weren't. So that's really good overall.
Mm-hmm. And so there's also, you've mentioned a few of the tactics that the students have been using. Which do you think have been the most effective to draw attention to the movement?
I think overall all of them have been. For instance, the sit-ins at the Liberal Convention were really effective. The media picked up on that a lot. Also, different themes that they had on certain days. So like the Wear Nothing kind of brought in like this, it was humorous but also brought attention. And boycotting their education, basically. So they have no choice but to adhere to their demands.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like there's been a lot of powerful statements through nonviolent protest, and it's definitely drawn a lot of attention, especially this lack of clothing protest. And it's creating a lot of visibility for a topic that seems to have not received the amount of media attention that it should be receiving. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Khaoula. It's very insightful thoughts you bring to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So our next two guests are Adnan and Gent, both alumni of York University. They were students during the 2008-2009 York University strike, and they're here today to share some of the comparisons that they've drawn between the current Quebec student protests and to share their experiences. So first we have Adnan.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, my experience in terms of the York University strike was a bit of an interesting one, just because of the fact that at the time I was involved in, I guess, university politics, if you want to call it that. I was a member of the student council, the faculty council, a member of the Senate. So I suppose I had a bit of an interesting insight into the strike. Personally, I think the one thing that resonates in the similarity between the two is the effect that it had on the student population, particularly the undergraduate population. It definitely brought out mixed feelings. There was a lot of tension within the community. Granted, the basis for the strike was different, but the effect on the university itself was, I think, pretty significant.
Yes. Could you go into any details on how these tensions affected the different groups?
Sure. Well, one of the things that happened, I mean, in York's case, the contract faculty, the TAs, graduate students, and research assistants, I believe, were the ones who went on strike. And obviously that put the entire school on hold. The classes were canceled. But there was also a point in time where the students' union, the undergraduate union, supported the strike, which really brought out those tensions. It essentially divided the school into circumstances where certain people agreed with that decision and supported the what was QP 3903, and other students wholly disagreed and eventually started an opposing faction that was meant to get the students back into classes and just resolve the strike as soon as possible.
And how did your official position affect your experience? Because now you're on both sides. You're part of almost the administration, but also a student as well. Did you feel that affected your experience during the strike?
I mean, I would say it definitely did. I mean, from my personal standpoint, I sympathized with QP 3903 and the reasons for the strike, but at the time there was that same tension outside what was the Senate chambers kind of resonated within it, where faculty members agreed and disagreed. There was a lot of, I guess, confusion in terms of how to approach it and how to manage the situation. And I personally, I guess, I felt torn between, my position, the university, and my want in trying to represent my personal feelings and what I felt was best for the students. So at that time, it really felt like being handcuffed because, again, the circumstances were a bit different, but it definitely allowed me to see how those divisions ran throughout the entire university, all the way up to the bodies that make the decisions.
So if you could refresh our listeners on how the 2008-2009 strike resolved itself, and if you think there will be a similar resolution for the current Quebec protests, or do you think there'll be a different outcome?
In some way, I don't know if I can go into detail in terms of what resolved the strike, but essentially it got to the point where, tensions were fairly hot. I believe the Ontario government stepped in as well, and classes resumed, but in terms of how the issues around what began the strike were resolved, I probably couldn't go into detail, but specifically what I feel might kind of connect the two is the fact that I think that opposing student group that really pushed for the strike to end, they ended up getting a lot of publicity. They ended up actually mobilizing quite a number of students, and that really did have an effect on dividing the student population that way. Really did have an effect on how the strike was perceived in terms of the media, in terms of York University's community, and it really did, I think, jolt people to want to resolve it quickly. Just because when such a large student population is against the strike, it resonates pretty profoundly.
Thank you very much for joining us, Adnan. You've provided our listeners with a number of insights from your experience.
Thanks for having me.
Next we have Gent, who was also a student at York during the protests, and he has a different experience than Adnan. So thank you for joining us, Gent.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
What are your initial thoughts on the 2008-2009 York strike, and do you see any comparisons or similarities between the current protest in Quebec?
Yes, I see a lot of similarities in the sense that both have shown instances where young university students or university students in general have been out of school for a long period of time. In that case, they're both similar.
Adnan had mentioned that the strike created a lot of tensions for the undergraduate population. How did the strike affect you, and what was your experience being a student at York?
Well, I found it affected me personally, as probably you recollect, it was a long strike that lasted for 85 days. So basically I felt that I had a vested interest in the education which I was investing in. As you will remember, the strike happened during the 2008-2009 period. It was at beginning of November and it ended up like 85 days later. Yeah, a lot of the students were affected throughout the school year, and in the same way students in Quebec will be affected, however for different reasons. This was a strike concentrated around the number of 3 bargaining units, while this is a strike that is initiated by the students themselves. For me, because it has support from larger masses, and because I believe in investing in youth and education, I was more critical of the York strike, but I believe that we should support the Quebec student movement.
That leads into my next question. Did you feel sympathetic with the York strikers, or did you not want to be involved in the strike? I guess, what was your position at the time?
No, I did not feel sympathetic. Basically, like a lot of students at York, I felt that if somebody should be held accountable, then it is the university, because it's ultimately the university who the students were paying to, and it's ultimately the university who should make up if the students are not getting a service which they are kind of entitled to, or kind of, and especially since I believe in value of education, I believe that the university should be held accountable. However, I did not believe that the union was really like working for the greater good. And if you look at it, you have to look at it separately, because there were 3 bargaining units, right? There were the part-time professors, which had a lot of legitimate issues, and then there was a research assistants and the doctorate students, right? Basically, the part-time professors had a lot of legitimate concerns. However, it's not their concerns that were being pushed the most. And the most radical bunch were the graduate students. The head of the undergraduate student union got convinced early on that he would support the strike, and that right away caused a lot of backlash from the undergraduate students. I actually had a friend of mine who was a graduate student himself. I'm not going to mention his name, but he also said that he did not support what the union were doing, that they were basically involved in a lot of radical tactics. However, they were destroying the value of a lot of, or the welfare of a lot of students in the meantime, right? There were a lot of students that did not have classes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Gent. You provided a lot of insight on your experience.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
That's all the time we have for our segment today. I'd like to thank all of our discussants for bringing their own unique perspectives to the show. So thank you, Khaoula, Adnan, and Gent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marius.
Segments were hosted by Layla Mashkour and Sean Pittman, and a special thanks to our guests, Rebecca Acheson, Khaoula Bengezi, Adnan Raja, Gent Llukaj, and all our colleagues in the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition. I'm Layla, and thanks for listening. Please remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/globalbeatcfmu and follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/globalbeat_CFMU. We'd love to hear from you. See you next Tuesday morning on Global Beat Radio.